People are often sold into real estate in very interesting ways, whether you want to get into short-term rentals or you want to get into long-term rentals. And so on today's episode of Raw Built, I wanted to sort of break down the difference between short-term rentals and long-term rentals. And no, this isn't going to be a video that's me saying, hey, here's why you should invest in short-term rentals. I actually want to cover the basis on the actual differences on both and which one you should be investing in and which one is right for you. Because I see a lot of people sort of, fall into the marketing traps of short-term rentals, high cash flow, quit your 9-to-5 job. You can make a ton of money every single month. But then I also see people on the long-term rental side that's like, buy a lot of long-term rentals and build wealth and retire off that wealth. And there's merit to both ways of kind of talking about each rental class. But I don't know, I think there's always more that meets the eye. I almost kind of feel at the end of the day, it's a wash, and whatever you end up doing consistently is what's gonna work for you. I guess that's the video. It's over. Bye. No, I'm just kidding. I actually do have things to say for both because I really think, depending on what kind of person or investor you are, there's one that's just like a clear solution for you and your business. So let's talk about long-term rentals versus short-term rentals, aka Airbnb, and why you might choose one or the other. First and foremost, I wanted to talk about the actual difference. What is the difference between a short-term rental and a long-term rental? Short-term rentals, aka Airbnb, are whenever you rent your place anywhere from 0 to 28 days at a time. Oftentimes it could also be 0 to 31 days at a time, depends on your municipality, but they're basically short-term stays, right? And on average, I would say, my stays typically range between 2 to 5 days at a time. But from a jurisdiction standpoint or from a municipality standpoint, most of the time it's 0 to 28 days, roughly speaking. Once you actually get past that 28 days, you kind of enter more the long-term rental side. And for the most part, what's common with long-term rentals is a lease where someone is staying at your property for 9 to 12 months at a time. The property is typically unfurnished. All the bills are paid for by the actual tenant themselves. Whereas on the short-term rental side, you pay all the bills, you furnish the property, and you host people for their vacations. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Now, obviously, there is this world between a short-term and a long-term rental, and that's a medium-term rental. We won't really talk about that today. We're really just talking about the two stark differences here, which is STR versus LTR. Now, as I mentioned, with a long-term rental, typically you have someone that's staying at your property 9 to 12 months at a time. And if they're a great tenant and if they're paying on time and if they like your place, they might stay for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And to be fair, it is a little bit more of a set it and forget it type of strategy in real estate. Whereas short-term rentals, typically on average, you're hosting between 5 to 7 sets of guests every single month. Meaning, I might be hosting anywhere from 60 to 72 sets of guests every single month. Is that right? What's 7 times 12? I should have done this before. It's fine. 84. I might be hosting between 60 to 84. Let me just make sure that's right. Yeah, 60 to 84 sets of guests every single year. And keep in mind, it's just one party, right? So if there's 3 people that are staying at my property on average for every single stay, then it would actually be up to 252 people staying at my house every single year. It could also be more than that. Whereas with the long-term rental, it's just one set of people, right? It's like a family, maybe it's a couple, maybe it's a single person that has roommates. But either way, the amount of people that you're actually managing on a yearly basis is significantly less. And so when you actually think about the short-term side, well, some people might say, why on earth would I want to host upward of 250 people on my property every single year? And the answer is pretty easy: higher cash flow. That's really why anyone, in my opinion, would really ever choose short-term rentals over long-term rentals. Typically, you can expect cash flow, which is the amount of profit that you make every single month after all of your expenses, to be between 2 to 5 times higher than the cash flow on a long-term rental. Now, there is no stat here. I'm sure you can look up different things, but in general, here's how I classify the income that you can make from a short-term rental versus a long-term rental. A short-term rental or a long-term rental, you can think of it as like 1x. So if a long-term rental brings in, let's say, $1,000 a month, from a short-term rental standpoint, I would say that it's possible for that same unit to make $2,000 to $5,000 a month, personally. Now that's gross revenue, but typically after all of your expenses, you are left with a juicier amount of profit than a long-term rental. And so you might ask yourself, okay, well, if it's actually possible to make 2 to 5 times more with the short-term rental, why on earth would I ever deal with a long-term rental? And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about next, because there is no free lunch, right? Like, obviously, if you can make 2 to 5 times more, why wouldn't you do it? And the simple answer is there's so much more management that goes into short-term rentals than long-term rentals. That, simply put, with 250 guests plus every single year, I mean, you're talking a lot of people. A lot of easy guests, a lot of so-so guests, a lot of high-maintenance guests, and every so often, Karens, right? And then maybe you might have parties, and you might have things that go wrong in that short-term rental. And so it's more of a people business, right? You still have to be hospitable. You still have to show hospitality. I'm going to coin that word. You still have to show hospitality. And that's kind of like the dual part of this whole Airbnb short-term rental thing is it isn't a set it and forget it thing. And we can talk about property managers a little later, but at the end of the day, Airbnb and short-term rentals, if you own the property, I'm not talking about co-hosting or rental arbitrage. If you own the property, it is part ways real estate and part ways hospitality. You know, it's kind of like a hotel in a sense, which I know is like, ooh, you don't really want to equate the two, but that is basically what it is. Whereas long-term rentals is really just real estate. You have a tenant in there, and granted, things go wrong, and you have to work with that tenant and make sure that you are providing them a great spacious or a great kind of quality, safe space and all that jazz. But for the most part, there is significantly less management with that tenant because you might get to know that tenant. You might have a rapport with that tenant. That tenant might be pretty low maintenance. And I'm not saying that having a long-term rental will necessarily be easier because you can obviously have a nightmare tenant as well. But for the most part, it is set it, forget it. You have one tenant for 12 months. You really don't have to deal with that tenant all that much compared to dealing with 5 to 7 sets of groups every single month. And so that is sort of the trade-off where you will make more money with Airbnb, no doubt, 100%. There's a lot more money to be made there. However, you will pay for it with your time. And I don't care how many people tell you that Airbnb is a passive investment and how if you automate your business, you can sit on a beach and make $10,000 just like all the gurus out there on Instagram Reels and TikTok. It's not true. I have said on the channel many times, you can automate up to 80% of your business. I really believe that. I think you can cut down the management from 12 to 15 hours a week down to 3 to 5, maybe less. Like it depends on how many properties you have, but I do think it's possible. But I'm gonna tell you this. I've got a property manager, she's my assistant. I've got a business partner. I've got people that help me run my portfolio of 40 plus doors, and it's not passive. Like I'm still pretty ingrained in it. Now, granted, I choose to be involved in that business a little more than I should, but it's still not passive. But I make a lot more money with my 40 doors than I ever would with 40 equivalent long-term rental doors. And so you have to ask yourself, do I want to deal with more guest phone calls and more crazy guests and with retaliatory, I'm pretty sure that's how you say that, rebellious reviews? You have to deal with that kind of stuff. And for most people that get into the short-term rental game, they think it's worth it. They think it's worth the extra cash flow. I personally think that as well. But then there are a lot of people, you know, when you talk about all the people that are leaving the short-term rental space and they're saying my Airbnb is dying and it's oversaturated and it's way too much time. Well, those people really weren't cut out to be short-term rental hosts for a lot of reasons. They weren't cut out for the management. They're bad operators. They were really cheap about it. They were the typical long-term rental landlord that was really cheap, you know, setting up their long-term rental. Those people also migrate to short-term rentals and really invest poorly in their short-term rentals. And they also say, well, it's oversaturated because they didn't invest in it. Now their place is suffering. And so you hear all this like bad press about short-term rentals and Airbnb, when at the end of the day, they just weren't cut out for Airbnb. And that doesn't make it a less viable investment a less viable investment vehicle for people. It just means that those people did not, they kind of fell for the marketing trap. The high cash flow, live on a beach, $10,000 a month. Not all of them, but I'm overgeneralizing, of course. But you hear kind of the stories on both sides, and I always hear people arguing like, this is better and this is better, and I'm like, it's all kind of the same. It just depends on what you feel like you can handle. Now, with that said, There is something to be said about the fact that long-term rentals are something that you can definitely work a 9 to 5 and manage. You can hire a property manager. You can truly live like a bit more of a passive lifestyle there. And it's more stable, and it's a heck of a lot volatile than you'll have to deal with short-term rentals, especially when you get into the fact that short-term rentals can be a little risky sometimes from a regulation standpoint. And when you buy a short-term rental, it's not guaranteed that your city is going to make short-term rentals or keep short-term rentals legal. It's very possible they could be banned, they could be regulated. There's some volatility there, and so you have to kind of accept that along with the more management and maintenance, along with the higher cash flow, right? So that's kind of where you have to like value your time and if it's worth it to you. Whereas with the long-term rental, you never really have to deal with a city outlawing long-term rentals. It's not really a thing. I'm sure it's happened. I'm sure it might happen. I don't know. It's kind of weird. It doesn't really happen. You'll see HOAs kind of regulate this type of thing, but most of the time, if you buy a long-term rental, you can pretty much be assured that it's going to be that you'll never have to worry about any kind of regulation. Now, on the opposite side of that, there is the very real problem that you might have a long-term tenant that squats and you have to evict them and all that good stuff. You have to deal with evictions on long-term rentals, but you also have to deal with evictions and squatters on short-term rentals and on medium-term rentals, and whatever type of real estate that exists, squatters will always exist. And this, I maybe should do a video on this because people keep sending me messages and they're like, Rob, what are your thoughts on, oh no, I am just realizing I did not hit record on this, but thankfully I am recording right here. So we're gonna switch to the good microphone right now. Oh my gosh. All right. Hopefully this sounds a lot better. You're gonna deal with squatters no matter what type of real estate you do, whether it's self-storage, that I'm sure there's squatter stories there, whether it's midterm rentals or long-term rentals or short-term rentals. If that's what you're scared about, do not get into real estate because squatters don't magically go away depending on whatever asset class you choose, unless obvious. I mean, there's some obvious ones where you're not gonna have to deal with it, but overall, like if you're really scared about squatters, don't do it. That's a real risk that you face no matter what. Now, getting into sort of the cost and the benefit, there's a few things that you have to really understand from a from a tax standpoint as well. Long-term rentals really, you get tax benefits on both sides, but with long-term rentals, you basically get like what's called like a straight line depreciation, and that's something that you can claim. I'm not going to get too much into the tax side of things here because it's not what I'm comfortable talking about on YouTube, but I will say that short-term rentals have this very, very beautiful thing called the short-term rental loophole. And basically what the short-term rental loophole says is it's all legal, I swear, but it basically says if you actively manage your property, if you self-manage your property and you are materially participating in the management, you can take advantage of what's called bonus depreciation. And that's basically where you can front load the depreciation in the first year. And if you do so, you get like a massive tax break. And it's something that's really unique because it's available to short-term rental hosts specifically that manage their properties. Ordinarily, to take advantage of this type of tax loophole or this tax break on long-term rentals, you have to be what's called a real estate professional, meaning you have to spend 750 hours or more working in real estate. And it has to make up more than half of your time. And there's a whole criteria on this that makes it a lot harder. If you're a W-2 earner, you pretty much can't take advantage of this. However, on the short-term rental side, you actually can be a W-2 earner and take advantage of the short-term rental loophole and get a huge tax break. I have a ton of videos on this where my CPA partner at strcoseg.com actually breaks this down. This is the only edits we'll do, all right? Caleb, do the little shaky thing right here. Yep, you see it? All right, you can go and watch these after this video and it'll break down the beauty of cost segregation. But basically, you can go get a report from strcoseg.com, which is my company, and you can basically hand that over to your CPA and get a super crazy tax break. I can already feel the average view duration of this channel just going, phew. So I'm going to stop talking about it. But I promise you, if you own a short-term rental, it is one of the ways that you can really cash in on the wealth building aspect of this. I'm going to move on from there, but basically it's a really beautiful thing. All right. And then The kind of the two really big benefits of short-term rentals versus long-term rentals, and I know I said that this wasn't going to be a pitch on one or another. This is just from my anecdotal experience, is when you buy a short-term rental, you can use the home whenever you want. I think that's very fair. So I think that this like whole Airbnb avenue is interesting because if you go to Destin every single year with your family, if you grew up going to like a beach town and you hate spending a ton of money on Airbnbs or whatever, or all that good stuff. But if you have spent a lot of money booking Airbnbs and you think to yourself, well, what if I just owned it and I could just use it for free? Well, this is a really big benefit. Whereas long-term rentals, when it's booked, when you have a tenant in there for 12 months at a time, you don't get to go and use that property. Now, if that tenant moves out and you want to use it, then you'd have to furnish it. But it's not really like the selling point for long-term rentals. And alongside of this, I think this is probably one of my favorite benefits of short-term rentals in general. But one of my favorite benefits of short-term rentals is that you have the ability to go and address maintenance issues pretty quickly without permission, right? If you have a guest that comes in and they say, hey, this faucet's kind of leaky or whatever, you can say, great, is it okay if I send a handyman? If they say no, or if they say, oh, it's not a big deal, just you can get to it after I check out. Well, they check out, and then you have this window between their stay and the next stay that you can get someone in and you can actually address problems very quickly. This isn't necessarily the case with long-term tenants, right? You have to get the permission, you have to give them notice, and you have to get them to basically like agree to it. But on top of that, one of the problems with long-term tenants is there's this whole thing called deferred maintenance where maybe something is broken on the property or in the property and they just never mention it to you. Maybe they don't care that much. Maybe they say, nah, I can deal with like this little leak behind the toilet. It's really not a big deal. Plus, I hate my landlord. He's some, some weird YouTuber. No, whatever. Like, they may just never tell you because some people just don't care about little maintenance issues. And because of that, if that builds up over the course of 9 to 12 months, then it could actually end up being like a very, very expensive repair. Whereas with the short-term rental, you could have addressed it like super, super quick. I'll give you a quick example. I was friends with someone who told me like they had this tenant that basically left some valve or just something open in their toilet, and the landlord got the water bill for it and was like, whoa, the water, because he offered to pay for the water. That was part of like his agreement, and it was like $3,000. And it's all because the tenant was like, never told him. And so he's like, hey, what the heck, man? He's like, oh yeah, it was happening. I didn't want to bother you. And he's like, well, that was $3,000. And so he was kind of caught footing the bill for that, right? So that kind of stuff does happen with long-term rentals. And it's not to say that it can't happen with short-term rentals too. You definitely deal with other types of things in short-term rentals. As I mentioned, a lot more management, a lot more things to take care of. You definitely deal with more wear and tear because, like I said, you have 5 to 7 sets of guests at your property, opening and closing and slamming your IKEA dressers and your closet doors and jumping on your beds, and things get loose. And then if those things are loose over time and your cleaner doesn't tell you and people keep slamming those doors and jumping on the beds, it gets looser and then it bends and then it breaks. And now you've got to replace your furniture. And so I think that's something that's like really worth noting when it comes to short-term rentals. The maintenance is pretty big, especially on furnishings, especially if you don't have like a good communication flow with your cleaners. And I've got a good communication flow with a lot of my cleaners, and they still don't report things. Go watch the College Station video I just posted last week, my vlog. There's a lot of stuff where I was like, whoa, what the heck? Why didn't they tell me this? I had to go and visit the property to see it. And so it's a headache, right? And that kind of stuff can build up pretty quickly if you're not visiting your properties. So to recap here, short-term rentals, really great, high cash flow, much more headache and much more maintenance, but it is worth it, I think, if you want to go down that road. And then long-term rentals, set it and forget it, 9 to 12 months. You don't deal with furnishings. You don't deal with bills, like the utility bills, but there could be more deferred maintenance. You could have a bad tenant, sure, but it's more stable. And the big benefit with long-term rentals in general, I will say this, to kind of put an egg in that basket, it's a lot cheaper to get started for the most part. I think you can get into a low $50,000 to $100,000 house. I'm not recommending that you do. I'm just saying you can. And all you really need is the down payment to get into the home. And even if you go apples to apples, a $200,000 long-term rental versus a $200,000 short-term rental, Well, you still have to pay for all of the furnishings on the short-term rental. You still probably have to do minor renovations. You might have to invest $10, $20, $30, $40,000 into amenities. There's a lot there that you have to really consider from a cost perspective. Whereas a long-term rental, you put 20% down, maybe 25% down. You might have to do minor repairs just to make sure that it's move-in ready, but you don't have to deal with $20,000, $30,000 worth of furnishings. So that's something to keep in mind. I think it's a little bit friendlier to get into. And there's also, there's ways where you can mix both and you can do a house hack. And I'm not going to get into house hacking. I actually just did a video on that, I think a week ago. Go check that out if you're interested. But I think long-term rentals, short-term rentals, I like them both. I'm going to talk about my experience with both very quickly and then hopefully close this out. We're kind of cutting it close here. I wanted this to be short. But my experience with both. I've had mostly short-term rentals at my property in LA. I actually had the trifecta. I've had where I lived in the main house. I had a short-term rental in the back house, also a mid-term rental in the back house, and then I had a long-term tenant downstairs. And one of the things that I really appreciated about the short-term rental in my backyard was that it made me a ton of money. And I loved it. But on the flip side, my little short-term rental in the studio down below, I got $1,800 every single month from that. And that was nice. With that said, I had good tenants down there that were really good people, but they never paid me on time. And I always had to go and, be the empathetic landlord. And I was never like, hey, pay me my money. I was always like, hey, what's going on? And they're like, oh, well, work didn't pay me this. And I had to deal with that. But there was certain stints where I would just get that, $1,800 payment. And I was like, oh man, this feels nice. I don't have to ask for it or anything like that. But that is what you deal with a long-term tenant. You may not get that payment on time, but if you have a really good tenant, it's awesome. Like, I love it. I don't really have to deal with that with Airbnb, right? They collect the money, people come in. I never have to deal with getting money from my tenants. So that's something that I don't think people really put enough stress on. But in the times that I've had long-term tenants and they do pay me on time, it's awesome. It's great to be able to kind of count on that consistent income. Now, as far as who it's right for, I do want to talk about that a little bit too. I think regardless, let's get rid of the idea of passive. It's not going to be right for you if that's what you're looking for, unless you hire property managers. And again, even then, it's really not all that passive. I would say short-term rentals are for those for those investors that are a little bit more creative and that like to meet people. And yeah, sure, you will make more money, but you should be doing Airbnb because you're a little bit more of a creative investor. And so you just want a little bit more out of real estate than just a long-term tenant or a long-term rental where you just get your $200 or $300 cash flow a month. And, that's not really creatively fulfilling. So I think if you're an investor that is more creative and a little bit more, just expects more, they kind of want fulfillment out of their actual portfolio. I think that's where short-term rentals really shine. If you're more analytical and you're I don't really care about that stuff. I just want really consistent income. I want less stress, less headaches, and I'm cool with lower cash flow. That's going to be long-term rentals all day. I would say that, if someone was like, Rob, what should I do? And I'm like, well, what do you want? And they're like, I don't want to deal with any of it. And I want this to be super easy. I'd be like, okay, well, long-term rentals, because short-term rentals are not hard, but they are hard work. And I will always say that. And as I mentioned, even with long-term rentals, at the end of the day, it's not the highest cash flow. You might make $200, $300, $400, $500 a month. Of course, you can make $1,000 a month, but you are really fighting for cash flow. I think the play with long-term rentals is that you continually buy them and they appreciate. And 30 years from now, when you retire, you've got 10, 15, 20, 30 properties that you were able to accrue over your career. And then they appreciate a lot. They're paid off and you can retire off that money. I think that's the play. I would never go into the long-term rental game saying, all right, I'm going to buy these so I can quit my 9-to-5 job. It's probably not going to happen with the long-term rental. It can happen with the short-term rental. I'm not going to say that it's going to happen quickly. I don't want you to ever believe that, but it's definitely a much quicker route than a long-term rental. But I would also say if your hope is to quit your 9-to-5 job, I would still push you to not do that. I would say work your 9-to-5 job, build your short-term rental portfolio, figure out other ways to make money, and then maybe you can quit your job. But it's a much shorter path with short-term rentals, in my opinion. And, I think regardless, the idea of buying real estate, all that stuff, it's a long game. And I think too many people focus on the cash flow and they might look at a long-term rental and say, well, dang, $300 a month, that sucks. I don't want to buy it. But I made a video recently called The 4 Ways to Get Filthy Wealthy. I think this is the 4 ways. Maybe that's what I was getting at. Go watch that. It's right here. It'll walk you through the 4 pillars of real estate. Actually, maybe I'm not showing it yet, but it'll be here soon. It walks you through the 4 pillars of a real estate investment and why cash flow is probably one of the least important aspects of why real estate actually makes you wealthy. So go check that out after this. And I'll catch you on the next episode of Raw Built. Bye.